African American Museum. My name is Francis Johnson, and I'm here to tell you about a time long gone by. A time when I was the most important musician in Philadelphia. That's right. Well, my story starts when I was born in 1792. One of the biggest things, of course, was in education. You know how important education is, of course. So, right here in Philadelphia, it goes all the way back to 1766, there was a school for the education of Negroes and Native Americans. The Bray Associate School at 2nd and Chestnut, for the propagation of the gospel in foreign parts. So, that's where I began my education. I received my speller, and of course, the main book that I used my speller with, the Bible. So, with my Bible and my speller, I was on the road to discovering the mysteries of reading and writing. William White, he was the preacher at that church and the teacher at the school. Yeah. So I raised the question with him one day. I said, "Sir, when are we going to learn addition, subtraction, and multiplication, arithmetic?" He said, "Well, why would you want to do that? I mean, after all, you don't need to know arithmetic to read the Bible." But of course, if you were any kind of businessman or a farmer, you must know arithmetic. What happens when you bring your bale of cotton in and you say it weighs 90 pounds and they say it weighs 70 pounds? If you can't count. But I went to the Friends School, I went to the Episcopal School, and I learned my mathematics as well as the mystery of reading and writing. So, I was doing pretty well all in all. There was a Mr. Peter Mercer, an African man here in town, who began me with my musical instruction. From a child, everyone said that I had great talent. So, my musical instruction began with the violin. Now, they say the violin has an equal instrument in West Africa called the zetin. It's a very small string instrument that you bow, just like a violin. I have never been there, but I've heard talk about it. So, as Mr. Mercer introduced me to music and the mystery of music, also a number system, did you realize that? Also a number system, then I became more and more happy. Now, as I reached adulthood, I did a number of small jobs here and there to pay for my music lessons and to prepare me for my life. One of the best jobs that a musician can have is in the military. And sure enough, as I reached 20, here comes the War of 1812. Now, do you remember that war? Not really. It's one of those wars we don't like to talk a lot about. But let me tell you what happened. There was a guy over in Europe, a guy named Napoleon. And Napoleon says that he's going to take over the world for republicanism. Now, of course, here in America, we like that. You know, we're a republic. So we sometimes say the first free republic. Except I'm not sure why we say that. But sometimes you say we're the first free republic. I've heard it. I've definitely heard it. So, Napoleon was going to take over the world for republicanism, so every country would have a republic and no more kings and queens. Now, so, of course, the British, or the king, would be against us. And then the French and Indian War, as well as the Russians. Now, we here in America know that this big war is going on in Europe, and we've always wanted this part of America called Canada. You know, when the revolution began, the Americans right here in Philadelphia invited the Canadians, "Join us in our revolution." You know what the Canadians said? "Don't be ridiculous. How can you possibly be Great Britain, the greatest nation in the world? It's ridiculous, it's stupid." So they didn't join us. But now that the British were busy with Napoleon, we decided this was the perfect opportunity for us to capture Canada. Sound like a good idea? Well, guess what happened? The Canadians beat us by themselves. They didn't even need the British Army. This is the War of 1812. The British are so mad, they said, oh no, we're going to get them. How dare they? They thought that we were that busy. So they began to send troops, 5,000 Marines. Now we always remember the story about New Orleans. In New Orleans, Andrew Jackson. Now, this guy is not a friend of the African or the Negro at all. But he was in trouble. So he called out for the free colored people of Louisiana to support him at Calumet. And they did. A tremendous battle there. And because the fog was so thick that the British soldiers could not find the American soldiers, we managed to beat them. So, Andrew Jackson and the Battle of Calumet. You might often hear people say there were no African soldiers in the War of 1812. It's just not true. And Lake Erie, the regular soldiers and sailors don't want to go to Lake Erie. Normally, when you fight with the Navy, you sail up on an enemy ship, you capture the prize, and they split the money. The captain gets the most, first mate gets the middle, able bodies get the next, the boys of the ship get the next. So when you capture a ship, you, besides your $6 a month, you get your cut from whatever ship you captured. It was called a bounty. But how many ships are there on Lake Erie?
None.
Only warships. So the white sailors and Marines didn't want to go to Lake Erie. The black sailors and Marines did. Now, I'm only 20 years old, and I got the opportunity to serve with Philadelphia's local militias, the Washington Grays, the Washington Guard, and the Accounts Fencibles. So, I was such a great player that they decided to make me the drum major. Now, this wasn't done just because of my talent and skill. It was done because of my ability to manipulate. What makes everyone happy? Recognition. So, Captain Cadwallader of the Fencibles, I wrote him his own Captain Cadwallader's March. You think he liked it? Of course, he loved it. Now, of course, I didn't come up with this one on my own. All musicians need a patron. Hello, how are you? Feel free to join us if you like. All musicians need a patron, right? All artists need a patron. Mozart had a patron. Beethoven had a patron. Phyllis Wheatley had a patron. Anyone remember Phyllis Wheatley? African poetess from the American Revolution. Oh, we couldn't write that. Those folks couldn't. African poetess. Guess who she wrote a poem about? You won't believe it. George Washington. Believe me, I've read this poem 1,000 times. It's just a difficult poem. But George Washington, of course, loved the poem about himself. It said that he was a remarkable man. He was the savior of America. He was the bravest. He was the strongest. And he loved the poem. That's a similar thing that I did with Captain Cadwallader. I wrote him a wonderful song, Cadwallader's March, and every time his regiment would go out, they would play the Cadwallader March. And I had a patron, and of course patrons must pay. He who calls the tune pays the piper. So, in my earliest days, I was a drummer and a fifer for the military groups. One of the first songs I learned with the military group was a song called Yankee Doodle. Ever hear it? People don't understand the story of Yankee Doodle. It started way back in the French and Indian War, when the British came to help save the Americans from the French and the Indians. But Americans, we had our own little guns and our own little militia groups, and the British soldiers said, well, just stand on the side there, boys. We'll call you if we need you. And that's when they began to sing this song, this Yankee Doodle. Now the words, Yankee, is actually a variation on the Indian word, the Yamasee word, Iroquois word, Yamsee, which actually means jerk. So, a jerk. And a doodle is a wet noodle with no backbone or direction. So this song, Yankee Doodle, was saying that we were jerks with no backbones or direction. And when you begin to understand that, then you begin to understand the words as they go along. So, just one verse to get you started. Yankee Doodle went to town, riding on a pony, stuck a feather in his hat, and called it macaroni. What in the world is that about? Would you stick a feather? Of course, a fine hat that I have. Would you stick a feather in your hat and say macaroni? There's nothing about a hat that makes me think about food. But if you understand the time, everything that came from Italy was macaroni. The building style. Look at St. Thomas's over here on the wall. St. Thomas's African Episcopal. Everything is matching, balance, and symmetry. Right? A door, 2 windows. The Palladian window, 2 windows. The Palladian window on the second floor is named after the Italian architect Palladio. Many of you have Palladian windows in your homes probably to this day. You see the 3-part window in the middle there? The Palladian window. Look at the triangular pediment up on top. In those days, the guys wore hats that were shaped like triangles. They're called tricorners. So triangles, 3s, matching, balance, symmetry. That was all part of what came from Italy. Double-breasted coats, buckles on either shoes, all of those things were macaroni. Now, of course, since Americans had never been to Italy, they would somehow stick a feather in their hat and come up with the idea that it was macaroni. So, once again, the British are making fun of us. We were so backwards that we would have no idea what macaroni was if we saw it. But sticking one feather, you had to have 2 feathers at least for the balance and symmetry to be macaroni, right? So, those are some of the words. There's all kinds of secrets hidden in the words, you know? As I said, some people don't remember that Africans fought during the Revolution. They did. They fought for the British, and they fought for the Americans. Of course, the British said, if you fight for the king against the traitors, you will be free. Many people don't know that. And George Washington said, So how many people do you think fought for the British? A lot. Some say 12,000 to 20,000 with the British. As a matter of fact, when the war was all over, Thomas Jefferson said 50,000 had escaped. How many for the Americans? 5,000. So, people were aware of the offers and opportunities. And hidden in this song, Yankee Doodle, are many references to those opportunities. Yankee Doodle with the town riding on a pony, stuck a feather in his hat and called him macaroni. Yankee Doodle, keep it up, Yankee Doodle dandy. Mind your music and your step and what the girls behind me. The rebel crowd, oh what a sight, awesome was that figure. Thunder stood up high as white, they got a little bigger. Yankee Doodle, keep it up, Yankee Doodle dandy. Mind your music and your step and what the girls behind me. Father and I went down to camp along with Captain Gooding. There we found the men and boys as thick as hasty pudding. Yankee Doodle, keep it up, Yankee Doodle dandy. Mind the music and your step and what the girls behind me. Yankee Doodle, keep it up, Yankee Doodle dandy. Mind your music and your step and what the girls behind me. So that second verse, you might have heard us say, Father and I went down to camp, along with Captain Goody, and there we saw the men and boys as thick as hasty pudding. So what? Father and I were looking for our runaway indentured servants and escaped enslaved people. Now the song makes all the sense in the world because they're as thick as hasty pudding and we can't see who we are looking for. And how did they get in the army? The bounty officer would ask you a question. Are you now, or have you ever been an indentured servant or enslaved? And of course the obvious answer is, no. Why would you ask me such a thing? Of course not. So the bounty officer would pay you your cash bounty for joining and take his bounty for enlisting you. And when the regiment marched away from town, you were. And when the ship sailed away from town, you were. Until they came back. So, Father and I went down to camp looking for our indentured and runaway So the war came and went, and believe it or not, I never went to a battle. It's right here in Philadelphia. I heard about the battle down in Baltimore, but I didn't go. So when the war was over, I got the chance to play at Waterman's Tavern, the best tavern in town. Now this tavern used to belong to William Bingham. William Bingham was a United States Senator. And he owned an entire block at 3rd and Spruce. So when Bingham died and his family moved out to Rittenhouse area, then his home became the Waterman's Tavern. And I became one of the favorite players there. At Waterman's Tavern, I would go ahead and write, guess what? That's right, a march for Mr. Waterman. Always working on a patron, you know. So, with my march for Mr. Waterman, I also became very famous and very popular. One of the famous songs that I would play when I was there at Waterman's, of course, was this one. Take your time, Miss Lucy, take your time, Miss Lucy long. Take your time, Miss Lucy, take your time, Miss Lucy long. Just came out here for ya to play a little song. Play it on the guitar and they call it Lucy Long. Oh, take your time, Miss Lucy, take your time, Miss Lucy Long. Take your time, Miss Lucy, take your time, Miss Lucy Long. Miss Lucy Long was handsome, Miss Lucy Long was tall. The way she danced up, that she would make the blues fall. Oh, take your time, Miss Lucy, take your time, Miss Lucy Long. Take your time, Miss Lucy, take your time, Miss Lucy Long. So I didn't write that one, but became relatively famous for being able to play it. Now, Waterman's was only the beginning. I formed my own band, and we began to play at those assemblies. The wealthiest people in town were only, and feel free to come in and have a seat if you like. The wealthiest people in town were only those invited to the assemblies. Membership to the assembly would cost a full 50 cents. That's right, 50 cents. Can you imagine that? Spending 50 cents to be a member of a club? Well, I have to say that my music was quite worth it. And we introduced them to the newest of all the dances. Oh, you know them. The Biddles, the Youngs, the Carsons, the Cadwalkers, the Russians, you know them. So, they became my patrons. Now, at these assemblies, you'll need 3 things. Music, and 2 other things. Anyone guess?
Food and drink.
I know you are all fine Christian people. So you don't have to hold back. Libations, of course. And food. So for the food element, we had to have my friend, Mr. Robert Bochum. Now, many men and women had arrived in Philadelphia from the island of Saint-Domingue. You remember Saint-Domingue and the revolution there? Toussaint L'Ouverture, liberty, equality, fraternity. Sounds familiar. Life, liberty, property. That's the other. That's England. Liberty, equality, fraternity. That's France. Life, liberty, property. John Locke, that's England. Oh, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Yes, that's Spinoza. Spinoza, that's back in the 1600s. Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Toussaint said that he wanted to be a Department of France, and he would do anything for France. So he started a revolution. And in his revolution, he beat the French. He beat the Spanish. He beat the British. He beat the Mulatto army, and he beat the French again. Because of this problem, and on the island of Hispaniola, many of the people there would leave, especially the slave owners, and they moved to the United States, from Charleston, South Carolina, to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Many of their special servants would move with them. Mr. Bogle was one of those servants as well as Alpo, one of my own band members, who came from the island of Santo. So they would change the culture of Philadelphia by bringing this new French element here. And of course, one of their great elements they brought was their food, their culinary art. So anyone who wanted to have a party in Philadelphia had to hire Frank Johnson for the music and Mr. Bogle for the food. One of the gentlemen here in town even wrote a special poem called the Ode to Bogle. And in his Ode to Bogle, he would also mention me, Dr. Johnson. So, as you know, most Africans were enslaved. I was not. But most were. And what they wanted more than anything else, of course, was that opportunity to pursue their happiness. Of course, it makes a big problem when one of your rudiments is the right to own property, and you happen to be somebody's property who is trying to pursue their happiness. Makes a problem. So, in many cases, we worked quietly and silently to free people from slavery. Now, me personally, I didn't spend a lot of time in that because, as you know, my patrons were very wealthy, and many of them enslaved people. So I had to be very careful not to lose my money in an effort to free people. Anyone know Joseph Casey, the barber at 4th and Market Street? Joseph Casey? Joseph? Well, where do you get your haircut? Well, yes, Joseph Casey. Because he's a mulatto, man. So much mulatto that he could actually pass. I think many of the people that go to his shop don't really even realize that he's part black. So Joseph Casey also was a secret operative for this lightning train. Since we work undercover, sometimes it's money, sometimes I hide people away with my band members as we travel from place to place toward freedom. Now in Pennsylvania, we had a big problem. They decided that Africans in Pennsylvania should not have the right to vote anymore. Of course, you did know that we had the right to vote. In 1776, the first Constitution of Pennsylvania said that any man in Pennsylvania who was 21 could vote. There was no racial requirement. Now, how come we don't vote? Well, in Philadelphia, there were toughs, gangs that would line up in front of the polls. Of course, you know, for those of you who drink, you know that election day is your favorite day. Alcohol flows like water. All the politicians get you drunk. And these gang members stand in front of the polls and determine who will go in and who will not. Has anyone ever heard of James Forten, the sailmaker here in town? One of the wealthiest Africans. He has more money than Joseph Casey. He has his own sail business. Every ship that comes into town needs sails, and many of them can afford Mr. Forten. So Mr. Forten has his own sail shop. He has some 20 people work for him. About 12 of those 20 people are white men, but he himself cannot vote. He sends his workers to vote. So where do we vote? Right across the street down here in Chestnut. You walk right up to the window of the building. You put your vote in. If your boss is standing behind you, guess what he knows? He knows how you have voted. So if you don't vote the way your boss tells you to vote, then you get fired. So James Forten, an extremely wealthy man, also unable to vote in Philadelphia. Some of the counties people did vote in. So, but they decided in Harrisburg, a guy named Joseph Conrad said, Africans should not be able to vote. They will alter the vote. They will change our citizenship. Let's remove the vote. So, 1813, they began to work to remove the vote. James Fortin wrote the letter of the colored citizen. Oh, I didn't know how to write that. James Fortin wrote the letter of the colored citizen and said he demanded, he had fought in the revolution, and he demanded to continue with his right to vote. So, as the War of 1812 ended, Africans would continue on with the vote. Now, one of my favorite songs to play is a song that I often play in church. Also written around the time I was born. I'm sure you've heard of it. It's written by a man who was a slave dealer. He had boats and he traveled around the world, buying Africans and selling them for a profit. They say one day his ship was in grave danger. He was in danger of losing his life and losing his cargo, and he prayed to the Lord, Lord, if you'll just save me, I'll free my cargo. Another man was saved. His name was Newton. His cargo was freed, and he went on to write this song. Some musicians say he stole the song and the melody from the Africans that he had enslaved. I'm sure you'll recognize it. Oh, by the way, this is a harmonica, not invented in Africa. Invented in southern Germany around 1822. But it's such a great musical instrument because sometimes it's called a mouth organ, you know. Because you can play anything on it, and I call it a party in your pocket. You take it out instantly, you have a party. So, a song you may have heard. So, things were going well. I was making money. You could tell, of course, I was making money. Can't find my watch today. You could tell I was making money. Known around town, I would travel from place to place to play. And occasionally bad things happened. 4th of July. We were out in the Independence Square, the State House Square, for the 4th of July celebration. Of course, that celebration would call for music, libations, and food. About midway through the day, a number of the men at the celebration found it distasteful to find Africans at the celebration. I mean, after all, why are they here? They're ruining the flavor of our independence and our freedom. They're not free. This is not for them. Even though James Fortin had fought during the Revolution, even though there was the first Rhode Island regiment, even though Salem, poor Peter Salem, the names go on and on and on and on, up to 5,000 that I mentioned, who fought for America. So we had a horrible riot at the back door of the birthplace of freedom. Sometimes we would march in parades and I would have white band leaders say, we won't play in a band with that group. We won't march in a parade with that group. It's an insult. One time we were just down the road here toward Coatesville. And the guys refused to let us in the parade. So we just went to a house along the parade route that had a wonderful porch, and we set up on the porch and we began to play. Completely stopped the parade. The parade continued, and all the people stayed there at the porch with us, Dr. Johnson's marching band. One man was so insulted that he challenged me musically. His band against mine. Alpo, Connor, Anderson, Johnson against them. At the end of the musical presentation, he was yet to be satisfied, and he challenged me to fisticuffs. But without bragging, let me say, even after fisticuffs, he was yet to be satisfied. 1822, there was a horrible fire at the colored orphans' home. 20 of the colored orphans totally disappeared. We never found them again. This was an opportunity for me to write a special orphans cotillion and a cotillion for the firemen of Philadelphia, the firemen's cotillion. Do you know that the fire companies in Philadelphia were virtually gangs? Did you know that? That's right. That's right. They didn't like horses to pull those heavy engines, so they would have 20, 30, 40 men to pull the engines. And the men were from their particular neighborhood, like a club. So, the union was against the contributorship. Many times when they would arrive at a fire, it was all dependent on your fire insurance marker. If you had your marker on your house, then you were insured. If you didn't have a marker on your house, then it was open to negotiation. Sometimes the fire companies would show up, and rather than put out the fire, they would battle each other over old problems and old fights that they had. These fire companies grew into the gangs that would dominate Philadelphia. The Moyamensing murderers, the Philadelphia killers, the Schuylkill Rangers. So, in the 1920s, we began to see these series of gang fights and a series of riots. There's a man from New York, a black man from New York named David Ruckles, and he said, forget this place. Let's go back. Let's go back to Africa, to Liberia. It was a good idea, but I didn't like the guys who started it. Bushrod Washington, George Washington's cousin. That "Oh Say Can You See" guy. Francis Scott Key. These guys only want to send people like me back to Africa. Those who were free. They didn't want to free anybody and send them to Africa. I believe that they were really just trying to take away the pressure so that those enslaved would remain enslaved. I didn't buy it, but thousands of people did and went off to start a new country, the country of Liberia. By the way, not the first country in Africa established by African Americans. Anybody know the first one? You're going to be beside yourself. The name of the capital is so easy. Freetown. Sierra Leone. Remember those 20,000 people who escaped with the British? Well, the British don't like Africans much more than the Americans do. So they had to get rid of them, and Freetown, Sierra Leone. So, to win the gang's over, I wrote songs for the fire company. There's some new music that's coming around, too, about this time. Something they call minstrel music. The Georgia minstrels. I got the impression that these fellas saw us making money, and they decided, well, we should make that money. And of course, there were people who said, well, you can't play that music, you're not an African. Yeah, well, I'm not sure who made that rule up. But nonetheless, there was pressure on them not to play the African songs and melodies. So you know what they did? Burnt cork. They blackened their faces, they whitened their lips, and guess what? You could not tell who was African And who was not? In a few short years. But just a test. The most famous of the minstrels. Who's heard of Picayune Butler? Picayune Butler of Barbados. Famous minstrel. Who's heard of Big Daddy Rice? Big Daddy Rice. Famous Big Daddy. What? Who's heard of Stephen Foster? Stephen Foster. What? Well, I'm really quite surprised no one's heard of Stephen Foster. Stephen Foster was a white musician who played many songs. Some people say that he learned the songs from his black mistress. One of his most famous songs, I'll play it on harmonica. I'm sure you'll recognize it. Has to do with the Western movement, and it happens right at the Great Removal. Well, about this time, things started going really bad in Philadelphia. Riot after riot after riot. I decided that I was going to take a trip to Europe. I heard there were great economic opportunities there. So I organized my four-piece, and off we went. In England, we had the opportunity to play for Queen Victoria. One of the reasons for the riots in Philadelphia was Queen Victoria decided she was going to end slavery in all of the British colonies. This did not sit well with the Philadelphians. 1834, she made the indenture of all the enslaved people. 1834, the riots started in earnest. 1835. By 1837, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court and the Pennsylvania government had decided to change the Constitution by adding one word to the citizenship requirement. White. Africans like myself lost the right to vote. There was the letter of 40,000 written to the Congress, demanding that we keep and maintain our rights. And the Congress, John Sargent, said, "No, thank you. No more rights for the African in Pennsylvania." But while I was in England with the Queen, I decided to write a very special song for the Queen. Of course, patrons are very, very important. And you remember I wrote the song for General Caldwell. Look how well that did. Phillips Whitney wrote the poem for George Washington. So as I write the song for Queen Victoria, things will go well. I called it Victoria's Gala. And while I was in England writing for Victoria, the ladies here in Philadelphia had built a Pennsylvania Hall. They called it an abolitionist hall, a place where you could meet to talk about freedom, a place where you could meet to talk about Native American rights, women's rights. So they built a new hall, and because the women had spent their time sewing and cooking, they were the first one with the Women's National and Second National Anti-Slavery Convention. A young woman, a white woman from South Carolina, Angelina Grimke, stood up, and on the third day she began to talk about Native American rights. The Philadelphia City, she out of her mind. Number one, why is a woman speaking in public? That's ridiculous. Number two, what in the world is she talking about? We're trying to get rid of the Creeks, the Choctaw, the Seminole, the Chickasaw, and the Cherokee. So she began to speak. They began to throw bricks and brickbats into the windows. This was the third day that the building was open, And by the end of that night, that building would be burnt down. Now, I often say that it was burnt to the ground, and people often go over and point to me and say, Francis, you still see the brick walls. So it wasn't really burnt to the ground, but it was certainly burnt up. So after 3 days, the Pennsylvania Hall was set on fire. While they were burning the Pennsylvania Hall, I was writing this song for Queen Victoria. Victoria's gown. So, I came back from Europe. I had new music. I brought back a new style of music called the waltz. And this is my most famous waltz. It's called the New Bird Waltz. Now, one of my innovations here is to try to add the sounds of a bird into the song. See if you can hear it. Well, yes, my band was famous, and as I said, the most important people and the most ordinary people would hire us. They sent us to Saratoga Springs, and we began to have a concert at Saratoga Springs in New York. We were the ones who began the summer concert series there. From what I understand, they still have it today. So, unfortunately, as I reached my 50th year, I began to be ill. No one had any idea what was wrong with me, and soon my life would come to an end. My band members went on to continue our tradition, and at my funeral, they would play this song, a song that I initially wrote in 1832 for the centennial of George Washington's death. It was a song that we called the Dirge. You may know it as "When He Calls, I Will Come." So those are the words that they added to my song, and it became a very popular hymn. So, the Dirge. I have a lot of pockets, but I can't lose a harmonica, can I? Aha, Thank you, man. There it is. So, my band and I traveled into the South at that point, 1832, into Virginia, to George Washington's grave. And we played at that site. And this was the song that we played there, and also the song that they played for me. The young Robert Douglas Jr., Sarah Mapp's son, wrote a special poem talking about the day that the music died, talking about the tears and the joy that can no longer be spread because Dr. Frank was dead. So, it was a struggle from the beginning in the military when I began to learn music. To Waterman's, where I published my first songs, all the way to the end of my life, which came much too soon. So, as a musician, I have not much to say about independence, except to raise the question, what does independence have to do with freedom? As a musician, I lean more toward the ideas that Spinoza gave us. In the French, they said, life. The French said liberty, equality, fraternity. That's what Toussaint, L'Ouverture, lived by. And the English said, life, liberty, and property. And the Americans said, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And in the course of my life, and in the expression of my music, I hope that I was able to help people understand and to pursue their happiness. So I know I've been just going on and on and on and on. Does anyone have questions about things I've mentioned or things I have not?
Standing invitation.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. We'll still be in the galleries to help you with questions about anything that you have questions for. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
See if you can find Frank Johnson on the exhibit downstairs.
Thank you.
Thank you, man. Thank you so much for coming up. No questions at all?